Finally, on March 1st, 1896, the Italian forces made their move. Against his better judgment, Baratieri ordered his troops to march towards Menelik's camp in the pre-dawn hours. He was misinformed that the Ethiopians would be attending church and would not fight on the Sabbath. But the Italians were in for a rude awakening. They were hit by wave after wave of attacks, and soon realized they were facing an army of 100,000 strong, 10 times their size. The Ethiopians, fueled by their determination to defend their homeland, launched fierce attacks that pinned the Italian units down. But the Italians, using heavy artillery, repulsed the attacks time and again. Ethiopian forces began hesitating, including Empress Tetu's personal artillery unit. She approached the faltering troops on foot and drew back her veil, both things that were never done, mind you, and proceeded to shout them back to their guns. Soon, other women had joined her encouragement and taunting, their manhood challenged. No one dared retreat. When Menelik released his reserve of 25,000 men, the Italian brigade was completed. When the second Italian brigade came to the aid of the first, Menelik drove between them, splitting the Italian force. When the relief brigade retreated into a canyon, Ethiopian cavalry rode them down. And by noon, Ethiopian forces had flanked and destroyed both the third column and the reserve brigade. Both sides had taken heavy casualties, but of the 10,000 Italians that took the field, only 3,000 survived.
This first Italo-Ethiopian war would end in disaster for the would-be colonizer, Italy. During the famous Battle of Adwa, Emperor Menelik's forces ambushed the Italian troops, leading to the deaths of over 3,000 Italian soldiers, the greatest loss of European lives during the scramble for Africa.
The loss of life on the Italian side, out of about 18,000 men, was close to 6,000. They had almost 3,000 prisoners. The Ethiopian casualties were even higher, probably close to 20,000 out of maybe as many as 100,000. But they won, so at least for those who survived, the casualties were acceptable.
This devastating defeat was so humiliating for Italy that it caused the Francesco Crispi government to collapse upon receiving the news. This defeat not only thwarted Italy's ambitions to colonize Ethiopia, but also shattered the myth that African people were incapable of mounting sophisticated and effective defenses against European imperial invasions.
The victory of the Ethiopians was definitive. It meant that Ethiopian sovereignty was defended, successfully defended, and that made Ethiopia the only African country not to be colonized during the period of High Empire. That's astonishing to think about. It was astonishing then, it's still astonishing now.
Indeed, in later decades, Ethiopia would become a center for other African post-colonial movements seeking independence. First centuries, Ethiopia stood alone in Africa looking to Europe for allies, but by the dawn of the 20th century, it had become a leader among fellow African states in the struggle against Europe.
There's a George Berkeley who wrote about this and said that from the broader standpoint of politics and history, it seems possible that the Battle of Adwa heralds the rise of a new power in Africa, that this is the first revolt of the Dark Continent against domineering Europe.
To tell the story of Adwa is to tell the story of Africa and colonization. The story of Adwa, as we will see, is a powerful reminder of Africa's resistance to colonialism and the enduring legacy of its triumphs.
This is a Frenchman giving a lecture in London, understood that the Italian victory, the Ethiopian victory at Adwa against the Italians was an African victory. And says that beware, you might look at Ethiopia rising, but in fact it's Africa rising.
Our relationship, you can say, was embryonic. But regrettably, as long as it has been and as related as we have been, it has been sporadic. And it is up to us as the children of independent states to determine whether the history of separation shall be our future or whether the spirit of Adwa can be our inspiration to confront the challenges of a new world.
After the battle, Ethiopia acquired a special importance in the eyes of Africans and black people all over the world alike, as the only surviving African state that successfully defeated a European colonial power in open battle. Ethiopia became emblematic of African valor and resistance, the bastion of prestige and hope to thousands of Africans who were experiencing the full shock of European conquest and were beginning to search for an answer to the myth of African and black inferiority. The defeat of Italy in AD Dawe forced them to recognize the African nation of Ethiopia as an equal and brought Italy's government to its knees, who had viewed them as an inferior barbaric race.
Now, the reaction to this unprecedented victory by the Ethiopians, by an African army, was difficult to understand, to grasp both in Italy and abroad, and there were a number of really strange misconceptions. I recall the anecdote of a newspaper publishing a caricature of Menelik, clearly depicting him as a white man.
Yes, it's part of the challenge of defeat at Adwa is that this is a defeat not only of a European army, but it's a defeat by a black army, and so it inverts the racial hierarchy of the day, which assumes European dominion over the world, and this not challenges the notion of dominion, but also upsets the notion of white superiority, and this has impacts around the world.
Johannesburg Star, that's on the 5th of March 1896, that's immediately after the defeat of the Italians. The Johannesburg Star said the utter and crushing defeat represents the most disastrous check which any European power has received at the hands of the natives for years past. It cannot but be deplored by white men in all parts of Africa. It is far from impossible that this great defeat may have even larger consequences than a temporary check to civilization in Africa.
In fact, in the States, one of the ways that I approached the topic was by looking at how the American press covered the story. And one of the earliest images of Menelik that went out in the American press showed an Ethiopian monarch who looked for all the world like he could be the Tsar of Russia, recently coronated. And then there were stories, too, that the Ethiopians weren't African at all, but in fact of Phoenician descent. There are different ways that people are struggling to come to terms with this very shocking outcome, trying to understand how this could happen and ultimately interpreting the events in ways that take the racial hurt, the racial dimension of the story away.
And the Cape Argus, on the same day, 5th of March, Cape Argus from Cape Town said, Italy is bound to carry out to the bitter end her policy in Abyssinia. Menelik must be crushed at any cost. And meanwhile, Italy will have the keenest sympathy in her latest troubles. That was the view of white South Africa. His sympathy with Italy in her latest troubles.
Now, of course, there were African soldiers on both sides of
Yes.
the conflict, however.
Yes, the Italians learned early on, after some initial skirmishes, that the best way to increase the size of their army was to hire local soldiers, mercenaries in effect. They called ascari, and they found that there were lots of advantages. They were local, they knew the terrain, they were a lot faster than Europeans. They didn't have the climate issues that European soldiers had to deal with. They operated very effectively at the very high altitude that Ethiopia sits at, about 2,000 meters. and they didn't have to be paid a lot. So you could have a large army without putting a lot into it. So the Italian army, in fact, is an army that's commanded by white European officers, but the rank-and-file soldiers, to a great extent, are African. They may be Sudanese, they may be Eritrean, they may be Somali, and some of them, in fact, are probably Ethiopian. But they're fighting for Italy. And they, so in fact, when we look at, if you were to look at the Adwa battlefield, you would see not entirely a white and black army, but you would see a black army commanded by whites. It's a very different vision of what the future of Africa might look like.
And the French historian spoke in London on the 4th of March, and he said the defeat of the Italians by King Menelik is an event which you should keep in your memories. It is the waking up of Africa to meet what has been hitherto the disdainful seizure by Europeans of those countries which we call barbarous. It must not be forgotten that in many of these countries now reverted to barbarism, there formerly existed an extremely advanced civilization, and that Ethiopia in particular enjoyed throughout Africa great renown for its refinement and wealth. Since then, it is true, he said, the isolation of tribes and peoples, the difficulties of communication and superstition, with all its attendant ills, have gradually brought about the decline of a portion of that region, the hidden riches of which you are now so widely coveted.
One of the aspects I most enjoyed in your book was telling about what happened both before and after the actual Battle of Adwa. And especially, I was impressed by the rise to power and the preparations made by Menelik. Do you think it would be fair to say that the battle was really won before it even started?
Yes, I mean, there is a sense in which it was won, although I don't think anyone could have predicted Ethiopian victory. Looking back, we can say, yes, we can see how this unfolded in a way that strongly favored Ethiopian victory.
Professor Muchi was saying that one of the problems that we have, a curse we have, is this weakness of leadership on the continent. It's absolutely extraordinary to read about this. Because Menelik, for instance, the Ethiopians had been fighting battles. They'd fought battles against the British, against Egyptians, against Sudan, against the Italians, and so they were sensitive to this fact that to defend the independence to guarantee the independence of Ethiopia, you had to deal with these possible interventions.
The way he does that is, a complicated story, but in effect he has to overcome some internal challenges. There are others who want to topple him, just as he tried to topple his predecessor. But he's a brilliant strategist, and it's part of the story is just to see how he makes the most of the limited resources he has in order to bring down a formidable opponent.
And two matters were critically important. One of them was the unity of the Ethiopian people in defense of that independence. And I'm saying it's fascinating to look at this and to see what these emperors and feudal leaders, royal people did, very conscious about the need to maintain the cohesion and the unity of the Ethiopians about the matter of the independence of Ethiopia.
The Battle of Adwa was a turning point in the history of Ethiopia and a testament to the power of determination and unity in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds.
My friends, I ask you, how do we not secure this victory when 1 in every 5 and possibly 1 in every 4 persons on the planet will come from this continent and its diaspora? Those who lead today have a moral imperative, not just to our citizens in our own countries, but above all else, to unity. The spirit of Adwa demands of us that we recognize that even in the face of the greatest technology being foisted upon us, that we can rise and win if we act in unity. This has been a message not given by our generation alone, but by previous generations of African and Caribbean leaders. But we ask ourselves, why does it elude us? And the answer comes not from outside, but only from within.
Message to all Africans that we can't. The fact that they met in Berlin and took this decision does not mean we must agree. And if we act, unite, as Ethiopians did, prepare ourselves as a fighting force as Ethiopians did, and make sure that we can mobilize all the people to engage this, we will win.
The red, yellow and green flag under which the people of Ethiopia marched to secure their independence became a symbol of the struggle for freedom across the world. 23 out of the 54 African states adopted the red, yellow and green flag upon gaining independence some 70 years later. The colors of the flag embody the spirit of the African people who fought for their freedom. The Victory of Adwa inspired other African post-colonial movements seeking independence. Because of Adwa, Ethiopia became a symbol of African dignity and resistance, and the colors of its flag represented the power, faith and hope of the African people who fought for their freedom. Today, those same colors are seen as symbols of hope, resilience and resistance against oppression, and they continue to inspire people around the world.
We as the African youth must take responsibility for the transformation of the continent. We are no longer victims. Adwa said we are not victims, but we are victors. And so we can do this. And I think that's the importance of our celebration of Adwa today.
Adwa zarinat, Adwa talant, mache tanassunna, yawadadakut. ምስጋና ለነሱ ለአድዋ ጀግኖች ለዛሬ ነፃነት ላበቁኝ ወገኖች የጥቁር ደም አምባ አድዋ አፍሪካ እምዬ ኢትዮጵያ